Tonight on Piers Morgan Uncensored, what started as a tense debate over Israel's media blackout in Gaza quickly spiraled into one of the most explosive live TV confrontations of the year. Piers Morgan pressed former IDF Special Forces Commander Doron Kemple on why international journalists are still being blocked from entering Gaza, asking the question millions around the world have been demanding for months. If there's nothing to hide, why keep the cameras out? But that was only the beginning. As the discussion shifted to the killing of journalists, unanswered investigations, and mounting accusations against Netanyahu's government, the panel completely erupted. The Young Turks Anna Kasparian went head-to-head with commentator Emily Schrader in a clash so intense it instantly went viral online. Accusations of propaganda, war crimes, media manipulation, and genocide were thrown across the table in what became 7 minutes of absolute chaos on live television. And what made this moment so shocking wasn't just the yelling. It was the fact that mainstream television finally started asking the kinds of questions many critics say have been avoided for far too long. We're going to watch the full clip together, break down the biggest moments, and I'll give you my thoughts throughout and at the end. Trust me, this debate escalates fast, and some of the reactions from the panel are hard to believe. Let's get into it.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because one of my big problems, for example, with the war on Gaza, one of my big critiques of the Israel position on it, and the way it was conducted was, to this day, the Netanyahu government bans international media from going into Gaza, even though there has supposedly been a ceasefire for many months. None of that makes sense to me. If you have nothing to hide, if you genuinely have waged this war in the most moral way imaginable, as they keep claiming, then let the international journalists in to do their job, unfettered, untied to government walking around with them, and allow the top journalists in the world to go in and investigate whether those claims are true. And the other part of the Gaza story was that there were repeated allegations of outrages, the killing of innocent journalists. Not all of them, I'm sure, were innocent. Some probably were attached to Hamas. I don't know, because I only know the claims come from IDF, and where there appears to have been some atrocity or some wrongdoing, they immediately announce an investigation. And then some people have gone back and gone, well, what happened to all those investigations? Most of them, we never get any conclusion. And we're seeing a similar pattern, for example, in Iran, with the killing of the school, with the 200 schoolgirls or however many it was who were killed. We still don't know, apparently, who fired that missile. And yet, every part of my journalistic gut tells me, of course they know who fired that missile. So why aren't we being told? Similarly, with all the investigations the IDF have done into all the alleged wrongdoing as it was happening in real time, well, where's the results? Where are the published statements about all these things? A lot of them just disappear from public view and public purview. And I have a problem with that. I have a problem with the lack of transparency and the apparent lack of accountability. What would you say to that?
Well, a lot of very important points. I think that all of this should be investigated and published. And again, I believe that no organization or society can survive without a kernel of morality, legality, integrity, etc. And for that reason, all of that should be investigated, and whoever has done something wrong should be suffering the full extent of the law. Having said that, you also said something about allowing journalists everywhere. That's not really possible in the time of war, because war includes a lot of elements that are undercover.
But there's a ceasefire.
And for instance, yes, but you know that the Mossad and the CIA are not on vacation right now in Iran.
No, but where there is a ceasefire, historically in modern times, where there's a ceasefire, journalists are allowed to do their job. And I cannot get a straight answer out of why the Israeli government continues to ban international journalists from doing their job. It makes no sense. It's an infringement of their freedom of speech and expression to do it. It's a failure of accountability, a failure of transparency. And, my message to Prime Minister Netanyahu, if you have nothing to hide, then let the journalists in, let them report. And that's, it's not connected directly to the New York Times reporting.
I agree with
but
that,
if you don't have
Piers.
reporting like Nick Christos, I'm not sure where it comes from.
In general, I agree with that. It's part of democracy. The only point that I was making is that if Robert's SEAL team had a journalist with them on their way to bin Laden, it wouldn't have worked in the same way. So there should be some areas 100%. That are concealed. But when there is a ceasefire,
okay, but that's
yes,
a good point.
But
hang on, but Doron, on that point, but journalists did go to the compound afterwards. They were allowed to go and investigate what had happened after it was all over. So that's the analogy I would use. Of course, you don't want to have journalists on the actual missions or during combat operation. I get that. But once it's over, once there's a ceasefire, even if there are, breakouts from that ceasefire, the journalists should. In the end, it's down to the journalists and their bosses to determine the risk assessment. It shouldn't be down to a government to say none of you are coming in. I mean, Emily, let me ask you that question because you're a US-Israeli journalist and commentator. As a journalist, do you feel comfortable that journalists are not allowed into Gaza unless they're taken by the IDF and are perceived to be friendly?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're on the same page. We have been for some time. Even while there was no ceasefire, I argued that international media should be allowed in at their own risk. And I say that with the caveat that I know why the army doesn't want, and it's not because of hiding something or not hiding something. The equation here is that they consider the risk to be too high, too much operational activity occurring within a very small area. It's not unheard of for certain zones to be off limits for journalists. We see it in Ukraine with zones that journalists can't enter. That being said, I agree with you. I think that should be up to the journalist to assume that risk. And that's who should be making the ultimate decision. I just want to add one more comment about what you mentioned with the accountability. I think that's the case in many countries, especially when it comes to war, that we don't really hear about the follow-up. This is a problem. But I do want to say, at least in some of the more recent examples, including one that you brought up, that disgusting behavior from one of the soldiers in Lebanon, mocking the statue of Jesus that was in one of the villages there. There was a response to this. He was removed from operational duty, and those who stood by doing nothing were also suspended. In addition to that, we also had condemnation from right to left, from the very top of the government with the president and the prime minister himself, all the way to community leaders.
Okay, but Emily, my response to that would be, yes, you're right, because there was widespread condemnation all around the world, and because I think the Israeli government panicked and realised how bad it looked, particularly with Christians in America, who are their biggest paymasters and supporters. But then it begs the question, if they can respond that quickly and with such clarity and authority and decisiveness and take disciplinary action, why couldn't they do the same when you had people being killed wrongly in Gaza, as happened multiple times, including, in my estimation, a number of journalists who were just doing their job. Over 200 journalists were killed in that war. And I'm afraid...
obviously, I'm going to dispute you on that figure, but...
Well, no, it's not disputable. The only dispute is whether any of them...
Because many of these journalists were not journalists, Piers.
It's not disputed that...
You're not a journalist. You are not a journalist, okay? You, born and raised in LA...
I hear a lot of background noise.
Now you're
I hear a lot of background noise, and I would like to get back to the question that you were asking, Piers.
For a genocidal regime in the Middle East. That's what you are. You're a propagandist for a genocidal regime in the Middle East, talking about...
Can we get back to the actual topic of this debate, please?
No, we're focusing on the topic of the debate.
Can we get back to the topic of this debate?
You are justifying the slaughter of actual journalists while pretending to be a journalist on this show.
I'm making the point. Okay, look, I'm making... Let me... Hang on.
As a propagandist for Israel.
Anna,
That's what you are. You're propagandist.
Anna, you can respond in a moment, but I'm making the point, which I think is a valid one, which is why is it the IDF and the Israeli government could respond so quickly to the desecration of a statue of Jesus, but cannot respond with anything like the same speed to the killing of journalists, many of whom were genuine journalists doing their job?
Probably Rob and Doron can answer this even better than me, but I think the most distinct and obvious difference is that one occurs in the fog of war, and it takes time to be able to determine who was where, when, what footage is there, what information is there available, versus a photo where you can clearly see who it was and what happened, and they evaluated that fairly quickly. Now, that said, I agree with you. I think there needs to be more transparency, and there also needs to be more speedy answers to a lot of these things. We're on the same page on this. I'm not disputing you at all on that front.
And on the question of the 9,000 or so Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails, why is it that so many have not had a free and fair trial yet?
Good question.
Under administrative detention, Israel does reserve the right in order to preemptively arrest people up to 6 months with court permission, and that is what's happened. All of those 9,000 are not under administrative detention, but we know that after October 7th, there were thousands of arrests in order to determine who was a part of what happened. In fact, I would go even further than that and point out that a lot of the Palestinians who were arrested, we didn't know because we didn't know on October 7th who had entered Israel. There were people they found many months later that were involved in the October 7th massacres who had been hiding inside of Israel. So there is an over-response to what happened in order to get control of the situation. That's not really unique to Israel. That's something we see a lot of times in war.
Let me bring in Rob O'Neill back.
At the end of the day, moments like this show why these debates keep resonating far beyond television clips or social media arguments. What made this exchange so powerful wasn't just the shouting or the viral one-liners. It was the visible frustration over questions that millions of people feel still haven't been properly answered. Questions about civilian deaths, accountability, press freedom, and whether governments at war should be subjected to the same scrutiny as anyone else. Piers Morgan's insistence on pressing the issue of journalists being blocked from Gaza clearly struck a nerve because transparency matters in any conflict. And when reporters are unable to independently verify what's happening on the ground, people naturally become more suspicious, more divided, and more emotional. And that's exactly the atmosphere we saw explode on this panel. At the same time, the debate also reflected how emotionally charged and polarized conversations about Israel and Palestine have become globally. The rhetoric escalated incredibly fast, and once accusations like propaganda, genocide, or ethnic cleansing enter the conversation, it becomes almost impossible for anyone involved to back down or find common ground. Instead, the discussion turns into a battle over morality, credibility, and whose suffering gets acknowledged. What also stood out was how mainstream media coverage itself is now becoming part of the story. For years, critics have argued that certain narratives around Gaza were either underreported or framed too cautiously on major networks. Now you're seeing more hosts, commentators, and even former supporters openly questioning military actions, civilian casualties, and the lack of accountability. Whether people agree with that shift or not, it's clearly changing the tone of public debate. And honestly, that's probably why this clip spread so quickly online. It wasn't just another cable news argument. It felt like a collision between two completely different worldviews playing out live in front of millions of people. One side arguing national security and wartime complexity, the other arguing that those explanations no longer justify the scale of destruction and loss of life being witnessed. But regardless of where people stand politically, emotionally, or ideologically, one thing should remain consistent. Civilians should matter, journalists should matter, and transparency should matter. Because without independent reporting and accountability, the truth becomes whatever the loudest side says it is. But those are just my thoughts. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Do you think this was a rare moment of real accountability on mainstream television, or did the debate completely spiral out of control? If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the latest updates and breakdowns.